Straight out of Compton. No, out of Brandon's selection for the Patreon selection of this month, we've got How to Become a Writer or Have You Earned This Cliche by Lorrie Moore coming up today.
I'm not a writer. You were a writer, though.
I
want to see some of those notebooks one day.
I was a failed writer. I'm saving you by not letting you see any of that.
Is there ever such thing as a failed writer? Maybe we can talk about it in this story. There's always room to progress as an artist, right?
I think so. And I'm curious, we've done a couple of second-person narration stories before, and you've always liked them in the past. I have to admit, I started this one blind. Just started reading it, no idea what it was. I thought this was an essay, and I was literally like halfway through this until they kept mentioning this Franny character, and I was like, oh wait, this is second person narration. I got to restart this whole thing. I thought this was like an essay about how Lorrie Moore, the author, was like becoming a writer and was talking to me, but it was a story, a fictional story in second person narration.
Oh, okay. I understand. So you thought it was like one of those idiots guides or whatever. What are they called? The yellow books in Barnes and Noble that.
Well, no, we read the Mother Tongue recently. So I just have essay on my mind. I thought she was just like giving advice to people who were interested, and she's telling her story. Hey,
you thought it was a TED Talk. Gotcha.
Yeah, I thought I was getting a TED Talk. Yes.
Oh, and so it's an actual fictional story. Although I think it is probably very reminiscent of maybe something that she experienced. It's in the story itself. It says, write what you know.
It feels very personal. It feels like acerbic. Like you can feel her wit coming through in this. And I'm sure it's drawing upon her experiences like a budding writer and such that, yeah, I mean, I don't want to say it's auto-fictional, but you can see that she's had life experience in the area, right?
And definitely giving some good advice, even though it may not be a true TED Talk self-help type thing.
Well, it starts out pretty funny. Right, like just the opening line, it is best if you fail at an early age, say 14. Early critical disillusionment is necessary so that at 15, you can write long haiku sequences about thwarted desire. And I was like, yup, I remember being in those creative writing classes and going through that. Like, I get you, Lorrie Moore. I'll get you.
I don't remember that. I never took any of those. I'm kind of jealous because I feel like I could be creative, but nah, who am I kidding? You're the creative one. I'm just the pretty one.
Well, I'll say this. What does it take to get to that special step, right? Like they say that you need 10,000 hours. I don't know if that's really true to become an expert in most things. And I think writing is something that's very different. And the way she starts this is she's saying, look, failure is your first step to get to how you get over that hump. And I thought that was kind of interesting that you have to fail in order to know where you need to grow in a sense.
Two things. I want to go back to what you said first and then talk about that, failure as a growth thing. First off, becoming an expert in something, I think that title again is so overblown that, oh, you're an expert in this field.
Oh, yeah.
Even if you're an expert writer, maybe you're an expert in fantasy, but you couldn't write a hooey worth of, historical, nonfiction, or maybe you'd be terrible at writing your own autobiography. So I think that in this, she's trying to say, even if you become an expert at writing, it doesn't mean that your journey is done. And that leads me into the second point of what you kind of ended there with, of this idea that failure is going to continue, pushing you forward. And I think that that's something like, as coaches and teachers and parents, we always try to let the younger generations know, is that sometimes the most you will learn is from your failures. And yes, it feels good to win or be successful, but you really will define yourself a lot of times by your failures and remembering back, that's the time when I made a change, or I remember that instance of when something finally clicked for you.
I wonder how different, though, is if we talk about the road. Okay, so I agree, the word expert always sits kind of funny with me. Like it almost sounds like a little like pejorative or some pretentious even, but
yes.
Let's just use it for the purpose of this talk. Okay. Like the goal, right? Like we'll use it in that context. Is writing different? Is the progression system of writing different? Where when it comes to, I don't know, computers, You learn certain skills in terms of how to learn languages, how to apply different languages, how the machines work. You go through a progression system of learning how this system operates together. It's doable. You put in the time into it, and there's systematic ways to go about approaching it. With writing, there are those systematic things about learning, like the haiku. Like they say in this part of the story, she tells, the kids stories, that the teachers teach her lessons. She learns about structure and writing short stories versus oral storytelling. These are all different ways of communicating narrative. But there's something still missing between just pure structure and success as a writer. There's like this je ne sais quoi that a writer needs to figure out for themselves in order to be truly successful, I would say.
Isn't that kind of true with anything, though? I mean, you always start off with the basic. Isn't that kind of true of anything, though? You always start off with the basics and kind of build from there. You have your building blocks of math or science or history. You don't start in the middle of something. You learn a piece of music or you learn to draw. I think writing is kind of the same thing. You need to learn, the basic sentence structure and basic story structure. And then maybe when you become, quote, an expert, again, I don't like that term either, then you can kind of start playing with things. And I think that's what old Lorrie here is trying to tell us, is that you can become an expert, but still not be a great writer. And you don't always have to do what they tell you. That this almost McTeaching or McWriting, for lack of better terms, like the, standardized, McDonald's, everything's exactly the same. Then in your writing, if you become that McWriter and everything is so stagnant, is it going to be fulfilling? Is it really going to be all that grand if it's so computerized, like you said, just it's zeros and ones? It doesn't have that flair, that spice that will make it you or make it yours.
Well, I think you brought up a good comparison in terms of music or even art, in terms of like, visual art, like painting. You can put in as many hours to learn all the different systems, but the thing that separates someone from being an educated person in a field and a artist in the field, I'm throwing these terms out very loosely, not having thought through this, but the difference of, that, wow, like I feel like there's certain fields, these creative fields, that the gap is much bigger. I think there are people that make huge advances in technology, don't get me wrong, but like 95% of the people can be successful without that mastery, right? Versus 95% of people fail in the creative arts, it seems, unless they have that mastery. It's like the top is so small sometimes when it comes to some of those liberal and creative arts.
I can't remember if it was a movie or a TV show, or maybe I'm making this up, but there was an artist that was doing artwork, and they were doing like book covers or something like that, and it wasn't their specialty or what they loved to paint or draw or whatever, and they were all pretty good, but because it wasn't their passion, they were just there. They're like, yeah, I just do this for a living. Here are my true paintings, and you could see like the difference. And maybe I'm making that up, or maybe that was from a story somewhere, but you could see the difference of something that you do because you have to, and do something because you're passionate or love it. And I think that true essence of who you are will come out.
Yeah. And I think, to your point, we see some elements of that in the story. She's going through the motions of learning the haiku. Oh, she's going to the creative classes where like all they do is just talk about, like this is, what is it? Francine, she's not in love. Yeah, Francie. She's not in love with what she's doing at this point in time. But you see, it starts out with her going through this progression system, learning this, learning that, learning this, and moving on. And I think there's one of our friends, Pei, he had a discussion here recently where he said he was talking about art versus entertainment. And one of the arguments that they were making was art is something that you can give internally. This is a piece of art. This is writing. But for that to be entertainment, it has to be received by someone, right? So what do we take about that? What do we think about that in terms of writing? Do you assign yourself a writer of I'm a writer, or being a writer? Is that something someone has to tell you? Okay, you're a writer.
Are they mutually exclusive then? Because couldn't you just be an entertainer? Like but that's how the audience receives it. If I am not entertained, does that make you a writer? If I am entertained, are you an entertainer and not a writer?
I think you're being too specific on the word entertainer.
Okay.
That's in the context of like the art. Think of this as is the difference between being like a writer versus an author, perhaps. Um,
Oh, okay.
are you a writer only when you do it for yourself and you haven't been recognized, or are you only an author once you're recognized by an audience? Let's put does that help?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I mean, I would, I think, yeah, you have to be somewhat, quote, successful or be recognized by other people seeing your stuff, reading your stuff. Otherwise, it doesn't count.
I don't know. It's an interesting thing because when I was going through some writing, someone told me, and I believe I was naive enough to believe them. They're like, if you say you're a writer, you're a writer. That doesn't have to come from an external source. Now, whether that's true or not is another thing. But I will say it was very impactful from a young Una who was trying to push himself and learning an art form and expressing himself in a different way. Sometimes expression is, I want to say, filtered because you're embarrassed to tell the real, honest truth of yourself sometimes. And only once you build that confidence, I'm a writer, sometimes that can help some people get over that hump. So whether it's true or not, I don't know if it matters. But if it helps you get to the truer form of your art, I think that's when it's accomplished its task per se.
And I felt like that was kind of the point of this story. For me, as I was reading through this, I kept thinking the one thing that stuck out was where they talk about the pros and saying that if you don't get this, you're not going to be a successful writer. Nobody's going to get it. And the mom even says in the story, you should give up and become a lawyer. And Francie's like, no, I'm going to do this. And I kept thinking of successful writers that didn't give us a traditional prose. And I love their stories sometimes more than any other story. I said to myself, what if they had listened and they hadn't broke the rules of your traditional story? What if they had listened and hadn't written some of these genuinely passionate projects that really brought out the best in who they were? What would have happened?
And they talk about in this story around that point, around the tragedy, right? She had the story of her parents going through a divorce. She had the story of her brother, right? And she said that when it came to that story, she couldn't find the words. She couldn't force the story out. Like it was too intimate, too painful. And we've seen that. We're currently in a 7-book series right now with an author that talks about how he can't pre-plan everything. He's they call him a pantser. They fly by the seat of their pants for how they write. They can't plot the whole thing out. So he's a pantser. He has to let the characters just do what they do in their environment, and he just documents it, right? And here is an example where there's a part of a story that can't come out because it's too personal, it's too painful. Sometimes we can't force the story where we're not ready to have that story happen yet. Another classic example, Kurt Vonnegut couldn't write the story of the firebombing of Dresden for 20 years and finally released it in Slaughterhouse-Five once he had relived that moment thousands of nights over, trying to forget it, trying to say, how do I turn it into art? Like he couldn't figure out how to package the story until it was time to come out. And that's one of the things that maybe is true about art is you can't necessarily always force creative things. Sometimes there's just a right time and you'll know it when you feel it sometimes.
So yeah, I guess we've kind of hinted around it, but for maybe successful writing or passion projects or any writing at all, as the story says, you have to make it personal and then kind of go from there and let the writing become its own living, breathing entity. And maybe you'll have the most success possible. And I know we've said that a lot, but I feel like this almost is a TED talk in itself of helping those young writers, inspiring those younger writers might be a better way to say it.
Well, isn't it kind of depressing though, too? Like she talks about even like with the love making, instead of being like, you know, the one that's like, love me, she's like, just do it to me, baby. Like it almost becomes like, kind of reminds me of some of Carver's writing with the, what do they call that, gritty realism, or Bukowski. We haven't read Bukowski much on this channel, but it's all part of like this acceptance that life isn't always beautiful. We don't need to make things more glamorous than they actually are. And I think she does paint a very clear picture that she's kind of depressed sometimes. It's lonely. It's sad being a writer to her. And it's not glorious the way that most people probably picture it, that this is kind of the TED talk of, Yeah, writing sucks, just so you know, too.
Well, I think that it's kind of like the realism of any job of there's great parts sometimes, and I go into my classroom and I have a great day teaching and everything is wonderful, and then the next day there's a fire drill and the assistant principal comes in and yada yada yada, and I have a terrible day. And I think that sometimes some jobs get a little bit more glamoury, vacation than others.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, by the end of the story, it kind of devolves into like a couple fragmentary statements and such. It like jumps off a cliff almost. And it made me think about how you talked about music earlier. In order to know when to break the rules, first you got to know the rules, right? And I love this story. My friend, he's a brilliant guy. He took a computer program and he's like, I'm going to make this computer write music. And you could take some scales and change whether what scale it was playing in. But another thing was how often it broke rules. So if you had it slid all the way up to where it always followed the rules of music, or if you always follow the rules of writing, the music always came out as Kenny G. It was like smooth jazz. No matter what other settings, whatever scale, it always came out as like the smooth jazz. I wonder what's the Kenny G of writing, I guess, now that I think about that. But you'll see at the end, she breaks into some fragments and goes off and kind of, even in the story, there's kind of a loose, tenuous plot of telling a writer's life, the struggles of the writer. But you've got to know what the rules are in order to know when to break them. And I think that's what she's demonstrated well here too in this story, is that she's known and does break the rules very easily. Like, this isn't the usual rising action, climax type of story. Like, I guess you could try to apply that analysis, but it's just weird, right? Like that, this is not that type of a story. This is a story that broke the rules. We're not in smooth jazz territory here.
And also to that, not only, you have to think of how to break the rules and why you want to break the rules. Otherwise, if you're just breaking the rules to say, look, I can write different than everybody else is expecting, that expectation is going to fall flat and people aren't going to enjoy it.
So, Brandon, fun selection here, right? Like this is an entertaining piece. I think particularly for us being so interested in writing, in the art, in the entertainment, the art of writing, if you will, the way that we consume it. This was definitely up our alley and a fun piece to kind of talk through, I would say.
Next time, pick smut. That's the Kenny G of writing. I just came up with it. I think that's it. Smut novels.
Give me the dirty outlaw smut novel. Let's do this. All right, guys, my name's Ben Una. Thank you for spending some time with us. Please subscribe. We'll leave a playlist of Lorrie Moore talks down below. Peace out.
Peace.